Дякую. I'm sure people understand if I begin my comments in Ukrainian, but the bulk of my presentation I will do in English. Я не буду всіх перечислювати. Дякую всім організаторам за цю нагоду, особливо до землі Україн нашим воїнам. Я тільки додам, щоб ви ліпше могли оцінити те, що я буду говорити, щоб ви зрозуміли, що так, я народжений в Америці, мої батьки родом мама з Харкова, батько мій з Полтавщини, це були політичні біженці після Другої війни, пережили вони Сталіна Гітлера і примусову репатріацію американськими та англійськими військами. Опинилися в Америці, тоді я народжений. Я хоч юрист, правник, адвокат, але я буду говорити правду. І буду я говорити прямо, буду я порушувати питання, яке не дуже обговорюється, але це в громаді, навіть в Україні, я часто буваю в Україні. І я не чую дуже багато розмов на таку тему. Яку саме? Що саме зрозуміла наша держава самостійна, яка вона там не була, вже повне покоління, 28 років, це все, що Євген Шарій говорив, це дійсно правда. Але для мене проявив дійсно правдивої незалежності, відновлення незалежності нас і розуміння або значенні самозрозуміння, хто я, що я, то для мене це я зараховую від 14 року. Але незалежність наша, вона не можна рахувати, що ми боремося оце 6 років, фактично боротьба за нашу не свою землю, це вже триває не поколіннями, а вже можна рахувати століттями. Отже, питання чому? І ми мусимо усвідомити, що ми мусимо далі захищати своє, те, що не котилося до іншого. Що нам треба зрозуміти? Зрозуміємо, знаємо ні до того, що Москва підступна, підла, і вона такою була і буде. Це в її крові. Але ключове питання, а хто ми? Чим ми маємо бути? Що в нашій крові? І як ми це відкритими очима на це не будемо дивитися і оцінювати, то я вважаю, що це самообман. Чому, наприклад, як напала Росія знову на Україну, знову, це 150-й раз, чому скільки з наших людей були шоковані, здивовані цьому? І в діаспорі, і в Україні. Для мене це було зовсім передбачене. По-перше, такий напад на Україну не робиться на ніч, воно готується вже роками, але що Україна скоріше чи пізніше знову нападе на Україну, що Росія нападе, це можна було передбачити. Ніякої несподіванки. Друге питання. Я хоч дуже перед громадою українською не виступаю, переважно говорю перед американцями, німцями, японцями, але все ж таки раз я говорив на тему Голодомору, до мене підходить один чоловік і питає, нащо мені потрібен той Голодомор? Для чого він мені потрібний? А я йому відповів, Голодомор потрібний, власне, тому що ти задаєш таке питання. Отже, чому у нас є такі вияви? Чому таке мислення? Чи ми дійсно вважаємо, що Росія – це братній народ? Хіба до такої міри в нас проголошені мозги? Наше завдання, на мою думку, їх багато. Але для мене це відновити чуть незнищений інстинкт національного самозбереження, національного етносу. Я раз заключив великий договір між Німеччиною, Японією і Америкою. Комерційний договір. Ми були на банкеті. Я говорю із головою японської делегації. Я його питаю, як же це так, що Японія так скоро стала на ноги економічно після війни? Вона була розтрощена. Він на мене усміхнувся і каже, дуже легко, воно само по собі. Я кажу, як це так само по собі? Він каже, ніяких законів не було потрібно, ніяких указів. Японці всі стали як один, запряглись і крокували в один напрям. Вони були горді, що вони японці, незважаючи те, що вони скоїли з війною, але вони хотіли показати світу, хто вони, що вони є, на що вони спроможні. І кожен вдома, в родині, в школі, на вулиці, по заводах, кожен знав, що він мусить робити, що він японець. І між собою навіть не ділилися цією думкою, воно було самозрозуміло. У нас того немає. Чому? Багато причин, але коротко говорячи, для мене, я вважаю, що протягом століть у нас виробилось, багатьох з нас охопив синдром Стокгольма. Тобто, закладники, в'язні виробляють прихильність до свого нобителя. Це психологічне диво, але воно таке існує. І бути українцем або бути українкою, це вже стає для багатьох людей другорядне, третьорядне. Я коли говорив з учнями в університеті Івана Франка у Львові 1,5 роки тому назад, власне, після виступу на форуму безпеки у Львові, якось розмова пішла за мову, російську мову, українську мову. І кожен, думаю, що людина знає, розуміє, що бути патріотом українським можна говорити російською мовою, не знати нічого за українську літературу чи українську мову, китайською мовою. Я знаю американців, які більші патріоти, ніж самі українці. Не в тому справа. Справа в чомусь іншому. І я студентам сказав таке: уявіть собі, що Україна була спроможна завоювати цілу Росію. І протягом поколінь всі в Росії розмовляють українською мовою. У Кремлі, у ФСБ, в уряді, школах, і кінотеатри, книжки, часописи всі на українську мову. А ще до того росіян підходить до сусіда і каже: слухай, що ти мені говориш чужою мовою? У тебе російська мова, а той його бере і на місці його забуває. Отець їм сказав: уявіть собі, оце власне дійсно, що більш-менш нам трапилося в Україні. Уявіть собі, яка була рубанина і кровопролиття і прополошення мозгів протягом поколінь, не одне, не два, не три, не чотири, не 10. А це тягнеться вже століттями. Що воно робить людині? Тут, я думаю, два чинники, може більше. Прочитайте Кобзаря, ніби Шевченко пише про сьогоднішній день. Правильно? Прочитайте. А який твір для мене ключовий? І живим, і мертвим, і ненародженим. Оце я раджу, щоб кожен із нас захакував у себе на чолі і запам'ятав. А яка суть його твору? Яка суть? Самопродаж. Самопродаж. Що ж ми мали реєстровані козаки? Продавалися. І в нас люди продавалися і політично, яничарність, і в релігії. Сьогодні продаються люди за що? За автомобіль, за айфон. Це в нас одна хвороба. І я хочу сказати, я не хочу переборщувати. У нас величезні, великі є герої, але це в нас також є така жилка. А другий чинник у цьому: нехай буде спокій. Я того наслухався і в діаспорі, і в Україні, аби спокій. І спокій, і спокій, і спокій, і спокій. А я людям часом нагадую, знаєте, що це є теорія еволюції Дарвіна? Що виживає та тварина не є та, яка найскорша, найсильніша. Виживає та рослина, той організм, та тварина, яка найбільш пристосувалася до свого довкілля. Пристосуватися найліпше до виживання. Але виживання мені не вистачає. Ще не вмерла Україна, це мені не досить. Протягом століть хтось випхав голову, йому відрубав. Випростав хребет, зламали хребет. І оце було таке перевіювання наших гень проти століть. Але з другого кінця, правда, з такого ґрунту виринули наші герої Шевченко, Леся Україна, Підпілля, УПА, наші воїни сьогодні. Але загально я вважаю, що оце у нас величезна проблема, треба над нею працювати. А як же це так? Ми є ті ненароджені, про яких оце писав Шевченко: і живим, і мертвим, і ненародженим. Це ми, які були у той час ненароджені, а тепер ми є. Отже, який наш відгук? Яка наша відповідь на питання, що я поставив? А Які ми маємо бути? Хто ми є і що ми маємо робити? А відповідь не тільки в голові, не тільки в серці, не тільки в душі. Відповідь у руках, в дії, у конкретному дії. Ми не сміємо казати один одному, куме, підкидай руки, то спускайся на дно. Таке не може бути. Як не тяжко не було, які не були випробування, треба крокувати вперед. І кожна з нас має себе запрягти і поставити на Божій ниві. А на цій землі кулі Божа нива знаходиться у нашій щоденній роботі і присвяті на захист України. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your patience in my going through issues in Ukrainian. I want to discuss two issues in English now, which are broader based than what I spoke about Ukrainian, but it all comes together. And my experience, I think, may be perhaps confirmatory of your own, but my comments now are based on the fact that most of my discussions are with non-Ukrainians, and not even with people such as from Georgia, Moldova, the Baltics, but I'm talking about Western Europeans, Americans, or people in Asia or other parts of the world, some of them who absolutely have no idea what Ukraine is all about. So I want to pose two questions. The first question is, how does Russia do it? Russia is one country that is leading 24 Western democracies around by the nose. How is that possible? Produce any product or service that anybody wants, other than gas. It's essentially a gas station that's masquerading as a country. It is a failed state. It has one of the highest suicide and alcoholism rates in the world. It has a population that's half the population of the United States. And if you take the United States, Canada, and Europe, the combined population is more than 5 times greater than Russia, and the combined economies of these countries, depending on what kind of yardstick you use, is from 10 to 12 times bigger than Russia. How is the present situation at all possible? A lot of reasons. The second question, related to the first, is how can the largest country in the world, which is Russia, invade and occupy the largest country in Europe, which is Ukraine? And for 6 years now, the West is unable to adequately deal with it, and as a matter of fact, as far as I'm concerned, Western impotence has facilitated and encouraged Putin's aggression elsewhere around the world, and now in Venezuela, and of course we see it in the Middle East and every place else. So after the first question, for the first question, the answer, I think, is this. George Orwell once said that the duty of intelligent men in dangerous situations, first of all, is to state and restate the obvious. And the obvious is that Russian weaknesses are more than compensated by the weaknesses of the West. In a representative democracy, we have a political revolving door, a lack of experience, an ignorance of history and geography, an abbreviated time frame, no patience, a low frustration level, everything that combines. There's money, there's the man, there's the greed, and the seduction of money and business. Both Russian money buying democratic interests and democracies trying to do business with Russia. Germany has the largest investment in Russia in a decade, despite sanctions. France is in that direction, and you can forget about Italy. And I fear what would have been the situation if there was no election hacking in the United States, because the level of public awareness in the United States about Russia would have been zero. But the primary gain, the primary advantage that Russia has in dealing with the West is our naivete, I mean Western democracies. I don't mean the people here from other nations, the Ukrainians. I am talking about regular Americans, even Canadians, and in Europe. No understanding at all of what Stalinism and the Soviet inheritance and legacy means in Putin's mind, in his brain, and how that propels him. We have no conception, absolute zero. So I give you the following scenario. If a militarized and aggressive Germany invaded, headed by a formal Gestapo colonel, invaded Denmark, the Czech Republic, or Poland, how long do you think that invasion would last? 6 years? No. The global reaction to something like that would have been instantaneous. It wouldn't have been allowed to happen. But we have it, and it's being tolerated. Tolerated in the sense that there isn't adequate back push from the West as far as Russia is concerned. I'll give you a concrete example. I wrote a letter to Condoleezza Rice in December of 2004. She was the National Security Advisor for President Bush, and she was nominated to be the Secretary of State in Senate confirmation hearings in January of 2005. Okay, so this is 15 years ago. And I was very much concerned that this is a Russian expert who knew absolutely nothing and understood absolutely nothing about Russia or Putin. When he became president in February of 2000, there was a conference in Stanford, and she was asked, what do we have to know about Putin to understand whether or not he is somebody that we can deal with? What was her answer? It will depend on what kind of internal income tax code he will support. Not a word about Chechnya, not a word about anything else. And I was absolutely stunned. I told her in the letter that Ukraine is the canary in the coal mine, and if the canary falls off its perch, you're not going to avoid the problem by getting another canary. It's not going to work. I told her that Putin was going to totally suborn Ukraine, and if he was not successful, he would occupy it. And how the United States reacted to that was going to determine America's global security posture for two reasons. Number one, if the United States didn't deal with that immediately, it would break down American credibility and it would destroy the international order. And number two, in particular, because Ukraine gave up its nuclear arms and its third largest nuclear arsenal, I named the countries, North Korea, Iran, and China. We're going to make the necessary conclusions about American credibility. She was at the dacha with Putin when I wrote her this letter. He walks in and points to the man behind her, and he says, I want to introduce you to Viktor Yanukovych. At the same time I'm writing my letter to her, this is going on. And he points to him and says, this is my man in Ukraine. Ukraine will be mine. How do I know this? I wasn't there. I know it because she wrote an article in the Washington Post 9.5 years later in 2014, only after Russia invaded Ukraine. The article was called, Will America Heed the Wake-Up Call of Ukraine? Well, she obviously didn't. There was nothing in the Senate confirmation hearings in January of 2005 about Ukraine and the consequences of that for the United States or for the Western world. And to me, things were terribly obvious. These things were not picked up by anybody in the West. You may or may not remember the Utah Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City, Utah in February of 1999. When Russia presented its show, what did it present? It presented Soviet propaganda posters. The ones that you remember. The big steel worker, the square-jawed muscular man, the buxom milkmaid with cheery cheeks. I thought for sure somebody in the press was going to say something. There was nothing. When I saw that, this was before Putin became the president, in February of '99. When I saw that, it was clear to me what direction Russia was going. I didn't have to know anything else. Nothing else. That was, for me, what Ukrainians say, the Dorovkaz, the indicator on the road of what's going to happen. Later that year, after Yeltsin nominated Putin to be president, before he was officially president in 2000, he celebrates Stalin's 120th birthday in December. Not a word from Western commentators. They have no conception of the implication of that. At the end of the year 2000, he revives the melody of the Soviet anthem. He puts the Soviet Red Star on aircraft and naval vessels. In 9/11, when he's calling President Bush after the bombing of the Twin Towers, he celebrates Brzezinski's birthday. Not a word. In April of 2005, 3-4 months after I wrote the letter to Condoleezza Rice, he declares that the greatest tragedy of the 20th century is the fall of the Soviet Union. That anybody in the West pick up on any of these points and make the necessary, inevitable conclusions of where all of this is going. When Putin invades Georgia in 2008, Condoleezza Rice, who's a Russian expert, has an interview with the New York Times, and what does she say? I told Lavrov that Russia made a mistake in invading Georgia because look how strong the world reaction is. He will never do it again. Need I say more? And that is why, to this day, you will not find politicians or commentators calling Russia the enemy. Russia is the adversary, it's an opponent, or it's a competitor. A refusal to recognize who in Russia, what Russia is. My second question, and the answer, about Ukraine. How can Ukraine be invaded? It was pivotal in the formation of the Soviet Union and in its fall. We know that the Baltic countries declared independence before Ukraine did, but Ukraine's independence drove the nail in the coffin, and the Soviet Union could not exist in any shape or form without Ukraine. We know this. Excuse me. Why isn't Ukraine known? Ukraine does not have yet the public profile and the understanding that other countries have, like Poland, even Latvia, Lithuania, even Georgia. Although American and Western politicians will say, and they will honestly believe, that Ukraine has to be supported as a subject of international law, as a seat on the UN, so on and so forth. Yeah. If you talk with a lot of these people, and that's not all of them, but these are a lot of key people, they are still influenced by the notion, they will never verbalize this, they are still affected by the notion that somehow Ukraine is an exception and it is ultimately part of Russia, related to Russia, it split off from Russia, it rebelled, it became independent. Yes, we have to support Ukraine, but it doesn't have the ring, the resonance in the Western mind that would exist if Russia today invaded Poland or something else. And that's not because Poland is a NATO member. It's that Ukraine doesn't have that mental visibility. And it goes, of course, to the rewriting of history. Russia is a 1,000-year-old country. It began in Kiev and Kiev in the Rus, and so on and so forth. And it is the ultimate fake news. Now, I was a little bit reluctant to discuss this a little bit further because I don't want to sound like I'm giving you a history, or I will dwell on this as my final commentary. And it is to show you how extensive and how powerful and how deeply embedded the longest example of Soviet-Russian desinform exists. Okay, Ukraine doesn't exist, it's really part of Russia. Kyiv is a Russian city, so on and so forth. I don't know any other example in history or geography where any serious academic or anybody else would accept that kind of theory, because here's the logical consequence. And I offer this because I've used these arguments and they work. So I'll be talking with somebody from the State Department, or I was talking with somebody in the Foreign Ministry of Japan the other day. And I said, look, let's assume that Russia is correct and that Russia began in Kyiv 1,000 years ago. Well then, since Kyiv got its culture, a lot of its culture, its alphabet, and its religion from Byzantium and the Greeks, then Ukrainians can say by the same logic, so-called logic, that Athens is a Ukrainian city and Greeks are Ukrainians. or because Vikings were a key part of the Kievan Rus Middle Ages state, then Ukraine today, just the way Russia is arguing backwards, then Ukraine has a claim to Denmark, Scandinavia, and Norway, and those people are really Ukrainians, but they're not aware of it. So the statement will be, well, okay, but Kiev and Rus and Russia isn't that the same? So my next question to them is, do you know that in France there is a northwest province called Brittany? Does that mean that the people living in Brittany are Englishmen or Britons? Or maybe it means that Frenchmen are English, or are the English Frenchmen? You can't extrapolate this kind of lessons by the name Brittany. And I see in my discussions that this person is starting to pay some attention. And this isn't terribly complicated. A basic understanding of world history, but I find that Ukrainians themselves sometimes have a difficulty to show the falsity of this kind of manipulation of history by Russia. What's the German word for France? Frankreich, state of the Franks. Franks are a Germanic tribe. So Germany considers France to be Frankreich. So what, Germans are Frenchmen, or are Frenchmen Germans, right? How does that work? It falls apart. Romania today does not claim that the beginning of Romanian history begins in Rome. They do not claim Rome to be a Romanian city. They do not claim that today's Italians are Romanian, right? Even though they took the name Romania, the way Russia took Rus. And Russia is saying, well, Kiev is the beginning of Russia, so why aren't Romanians saying that? The falsity of this kind of historical somersault is never challenged. It's used over and over again, and it has penetrated the psyche, the unconscious psyche of a lot of Western politicians who are honestly very supportive of Ukraine, but this unconsciously holds them back sometimes. And if you try to explain to them, I had a dinner I was talking about in Ukraine, I was talking about a closing dinner I had a while ago with the Germans, the Japanese, and the Americans on the major joint venture I had. And I talked with a Japanese fellow, and then I was talking with the German delegation, and we're talking about World War II. And I can see that he's not very familiar with his own history. And I asked him, well, don't you know what the reason for Hitler's war in Europe was? And he looks at me. He said, it was to occupy and colonize Ukraine. This is very, very clear in Hitler's writings. In his discussion with the head of the League of Nations at the time, what he was doing and why. When you bring this kind of fact out to people who, they may not know a lot, but people have heard about World War II, right? And when you tell them that the whole purpose of the war in Europe was for Ukraine, all of a sudden, they feel more receptive, hopefully more receptive to further things that you're going to say and that you're going to argue, because they recognize that something that is so critical, they never knew. And all of a sudden, here you are, telling them things. People don't know, for example, that George Patton, the most illustrious general in American military history in World War II, that Stalin arranged to have him assassinated. How do we know? Because the Ukrainian underground warned US Army intelligence. Ukrainians had an agent in the NKVD headquarters in Regensburg, Germany, headed by General Davidov, who, by the way, was in charge of forced repatriation of Ukrainians and other former Soviet citizens. He was there, and he saw the arrival of Pavel Sudoplatov, who was the assassin who organized the assassination of Leon Trotsky, before that, and Emil Navalny, Ukrainian leader in Rotterdam, and they brought him in to arrange for the assassination staged as an accident of George Patton. I tell this to my American colleagues, and they're absolutely shocked. All of a sudden, Ukraine becomes relevant, and you start opening up the gates for discussion and getting rid of this fantasy of Russian disinformation, which, as we all know, is enormously powerful. So at the end of the day, what's the bottom line for all of this? Tenacity, determination, commitment for all of us, and for every one of the nations represented here, in addition to the Ukrainians, for the benefit and safety of your own nations. You understand this very well as everybody else, and that's why we have a common language with you. I will read, on conclusion, something, and I will give you some freedom from my monologue here. Whether Russian-led integration on the territory of the former USSR will pose a serious long-term military challenge to the West depends in large part on the role that Ukraine plays or is forced to play. Ukraine will do much to determine whether Europe and the world in the 21st century will be as bloody as it was in the 20th century. That was a study done by the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace 22 years ago in 1997. Thank you very much.